Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined again by Edgardo Sepulveda, who, for those of you who don't remember, is a regulatory economist who specializes in telecommunications policy with an interest in electricity and decarbonization. Edgardo, this is our third episode, I think, in about a month's time work. I can't get enough. It's good to have you back.
Yeah, no, great to be back, Chris. I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed our two previous episodes, and I'm looking forward to this one as well.
And you're kind of breaking out into the broader podcast scene here. You had an appearance on Emmett Penny's Exhaust podcast. That was a great episode.
Great, thank you.
Good deep dive of the history of electricity in the States and again, deregulation. And I'm confident there'll be some more upcoming podcasters that'll be interested in having you on. So I'm always proud to sort of be your breaking podcast, but and I always think I should sign exclusivity contracts. But
thanks, Chris. Totally unrelated. I was on a podcast of a friend neighbor who does a sports movie. And I was on reviewing the 2009 film of Clint Eastwood's film on Invictus about that ode to Nelson Mandela. So right. It's fun to be on that as well.
Cool. We'll link it in the show notes. So. Yeah. Edgardo, I think our listeners have gotten to know you pretty well on the previous podcast, so I'll skip the usual ambush guest self-introduction, and I think we'll just kind of dive into the topic at hand. Really excited to do that. And, for the listeners, we'd originally kind of started off with this idea of doing a kind of, who got rich off of deregulation and who kind of benefits from current energy policies. I think we're going to touch on that a little bit. But we want to sort of frame that within a discussion of a few concepts. And those are energy equity, looking at energy poverty and various approaches on how to deal with that and how to achieve equity. Also this concept of energy democracy, which, as you've explained to me, is one lens through which to see possible responses to the issue of energy inequity. And we are very fortunate to be recording when we are. The Cori Bush and Jamaal Bowman sponsored House of Representatives resolution on actually, I don't know if it has a formal title. It's just this HR resolution, but it's been getting a lot of play on Twitter recently. I mean, to summarize, basically, it's a resolution calling for kind of a sort of nationalization and then redistribution of that new energy infrastructure, to a kind of localist, small is beautiful series of kind of cooperatives. It explicitly calls for 100% renewable energy. It excludes nuclear. We're going to get into that, but really great to be able to ground our conversation in something that's real world and that's getting a lot of play right now. With that in mind, I think we're pretty much ready to dive on in. So let's start off with exploring again sort of what this kind of bill is a response to, and maybe starting with sort of a global overlook, energy poverty worldwide. How that's been changing. I think Hans Rosling, may he rest in peace, did some good work, which is sort of on updating people on how things have changed. A lot of us are sort of stuck with a framework of viewing the world as it was in the 1950s or 1960s, where there was just sort of super low income countries and then a developed West. Now there's a lot of middle income countries. Obviously, China's blossomed economically and in terms of energy distribution. And I think we'll touch, upon rural electrification as part of that. But yeah, let's take it away, Edgardo.
Great. That's a great introduction. So I mean, look, we're going to be talking about equity but we also want to make sure we ground what we're talking about. So just in order to provide context, what I wanted to do is take us through 5-7 minutes very quickly where we are in the developed countries, in the industrialized countries, and generally the OECD, how we got here, and where is the rest of the world, right? So it was just a kind of quick update, just to give you a sense. I mean, there's basically um, uh, two or three ways to look at electricity, and one of them is access, and the other one is usage, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, having a wire to your house allows you to use electricity, but that's just the first step. Then you have to have the actual income to actually pay for the electricity.
Right.
One of the things that we look at is about total electricity use, and it certainly is the case that the industrialized countries definitely have a much higher usage of electricity than the middle income countries, or what are referred to as the least developed countries by the United Nations. So just to give you an order of magnitude, right, of where we are in terms of usage. um, the sort of the OECD countries that are around, maybe 700 kilowatt hours per month per person,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's about 700. Some are higher, some are lower. Canada is higher; it's around 1,300.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we're not the highest. The highest actually
It's Norway,
is,
right?
well, it's actually Iceland. It's
Ah, okay.
Iceland. Iceland is 4,500.
And I mean, but they're like an ultra low carbon destination
Yeah,
because of
yeah,
their hydro primarily, but they're geothermal. I know a lot of
that's right.
server farms and stuff are relocating there.
Yeah, that's
So
right. And
yeah, yeah.
also, I mean, but the biggest single uses of electricity in Iceland is our three large aluminum smelters.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. So one of the things that, it was first a Canadian smelter, Alcan, in the late 1960s. Then there was another American firm, or a British firm, and then Alcoa. And so you've got these three smelters. So, I mean, it's not as if Iceland mines bauxite, right?
Right.
They all imported in. They use the super cheap, zero carbon electricity in their smelters, and then they ship it out, right?
Wow. Okay.
And so something like 70 or 80% of all of the electricity used in Iceland is for those three smelters.
Wow.
Right? It's quite something. And then you got the other countries like, Bahrain, Finland, Norway, exactly, right?
Right.
But on that hand, you've got, on average across the world, if the OECD countries are around 700, across the world is maybe 300
Right.
kilowatt hours per person per month. And then the least developed countries are probably around 20.
Right.
So huge differences.
Yeah.
Much of that reflects sort of incomes, like per capita incomes, in terms of you may have the connection, but you don't have sufficient income, for example, beyond just lights, but the fridge, or some of the other.
So I was talking with actually my assistant here at Decouple, Dylan Moon, who just published his graduating thesis looking at prospects of nuclear energy in Africa. But one of his big arguments is like, listen, there's a very easy metric, which is electricity access, right?
Right.
In Kenya, for instance, I think that's increased from about 20% to 80. Their target is, I think, 100% by 2030.
Right.
But reliability is
Oh,
often the greater challenge, right?
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Um,
For sure. For sure.
and
Yeah.
that leads to these weird distortions, like in Nigeria, where there's something like 8 to 13 times more capacity from
That's
backup
right.
diesel generators than the actual grid.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Agreed.
that,
And this reliability is a huge thing, right?
yeah, and then the other, and I mean that was one of his arguments for nuclear, and he was referencing how Ghana had, with their large hydro dam, which again was built to support a aluminum smelter to begin with. Droughts have really impacted the overall development of that country, because
Right.
there's been several multi-year droughts that drastically interrupted
Yeah.
that stability. The other thing I wanted to just reference, because you were talking about the various consumption per capita in these various areas. And I'm going to be having Jack Devaney on. He's the founder of Thorcon, but he just wrote a great book called Untying the Gordian Knot, and why nuclear energy has been a flop. And one of the sort of great sort of background or graphs he has is looking at, the Gordian knot for him is how do we, it's the kind of the decouple knot as well, right? It's how do we encourage human development while, not screwing up our climate or damaging our environment. But he says, to get people, get the world's population up to a sort of European level of electricity consumption entails a doubling of current installed capacity. Right. And then if we want to actually decarbonize and largely electrify, it starts to get wild, like 4 or 5 times the global installed capacity at present. So there's a lot of room, obviously, to just achieve basic equity and pure electricity, but even more. And that's why these kind of, ambitious goals of, we're going to decarbonize everything by 2030. Part of me is like, I engage in a kind of aspirational politics, but when it becomes like laughably unrealistic, I wonder about, like, can you be taken seriously? Like, if we're Democrats and we're trying to convince a plurality, like, we have to not live in a sort of fantasy world. Anyway, I'm going a little bit aside there, but I think those are relevant points to this issue of equity and the scale of what's required to actually reach it, and the desire to do that with carbon-free sources of energy as much as possible.
Well, that's exactly it, right? And so we've got these, in terms of consumption, you have electricity usage. With the exceptions of the outliers like Iceland, at the household level, certainly being driven by income. Right? The higher the income, the more tools, the more productivity enhancing, machines that you have. For example, a refrigerator or an air conditioner or something to heat your home. And so there's a pretty direct relationship between income and electricity use or energy use generally, and it works both ways, right? Machines, energy that allow you to do things more productively actually increase your income. So there's a two-way street between sort of this energy income relationship. But in terms of access, I mean, even access has improved very significantly. You look at a country like India, or you look at a country like China, especially in the urban areas. You've seen increases from, say 20 or 30 years ago, that were in the 60s and 70%, and now are pretty close to 100%. The challenge remains to be mostly access to the grid in rural areas. I mean, we achieved that in the 1930s in Canada and the United States, or at least we started it through the rural electrification efforts. That's still an ongoing effort in much of the developing world.
In our last episode, we really reflected on the underlying regulatory environment that permitted it, because it's obviously and I think that's a big challenge in Africa as well. It's very expensive to engage in that. It doesn't sort of fit neatly within a profit motive.
That's right. Yeah. And so, look, I mean, I didn't want to spend too much time on it, other than to say that when we think about equity, there's a time scale and there's a geographic scale, and obviously, as we're going to get into it, Chris, there's also like a cultural, political scale as to what we define by equity, what you and I and what other people understand as equity.
Right.
And so, again, to move on to that, is the other interesting thing about electricity is that once you have access to it, especially in the rich industrialized countries such as Canada, the United States, one of the things that when you dig into the data, one of the things that you find is that pretty much regardless of income, we more or less consume about the same. This is one of those kind of surprises, right? And part of it has to do with the makeup of households, the quality of the appliances that we have, the quality of the insulation that we have. It's actually very interesting that in Ontario, for example, in BC, in California, the low income households again are using less, but those low income households tend to be smaller. than the larger households. So if you look at it on a per person, like on a per capita, and it also makes sense. If you're a single mom with a young kid, you still have to have one refrigerator.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? A family of 4, 5, or 6 who may be high income still has one refrigerator.
Mm-hmm. It's
Right?
probably energy efficient and the latest model, and yeah.
Exactly. It may be bigger, et cetera, but again, the differences aren't that huge. This is all to say that electricity is what we economists refer to as a basic commodity, right?
Mm-hmm.
It has a very inelastic demand, which means that pretty much regardless of price, people will want to have electricity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that if electricity is priced the same for everyone, which it
Right.
generally is, low-income people, low-income families and households will have a bigger electricity burden than high-income households,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So for example, a high-income household is usually using less than 1% of their income on electricity. A low-income household is going to spend almost the same dollar amount, but obviously their income is much lower, and so they're spending, depending on the jurisdiction, they're spending 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%, 12% of their income on electricity. That is what you'd start to refer to as energy poverty, right?
Yeah.
Where you're having to try to decide between turning on the lights or being able to send your kid to school
Well, and
or
God forbid you heat with electricity. I know there was that was a
right.
big part of our election or not scandal, but a big election issue was, do I pay the rent or do I keep my house warm enough
Well,
for my
that's
kids?
exactly it. That's exactly it. And so, in the context of this, what the electricity sector, not only in North America but in Europe as well, they have, together with the policymakers, have set up a series of programs to be able to alleviate electricity poverty or undue burden. And
Mm-hmm.
so, for example, here in Ontario, in California, you have what they call the CARE, CARE, which is a program to reduce electricity bills by 30 to 35%
Mm-hmm.
for eligible households. We have a similar program here in Ontario, the OESP. In France, you have energy vouchers. In Spain, you have what they call social tariffs, a series of measures to try to not eliminate poverty, the underlying economic poverty, right? But to reduce the electricity burden.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so 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 it's in that context of electricity being a this basic fundamental necessity, um, there being inequality of income in our societies, which means that there is some people, low-income people, who face a higher energy burden than high-income people, that you start to see together with the climate crisis, right? Um, you start to see in the 2000s a push for electricity democracy amongst activists in the United States who are looking for and advocating a specific set of policies, many of which are encapsulated in this resolution that we're about to discuss later
Right.
in the program. And it's basically looking for some things that are very difficult to be opposed for, which is sort of greater energy citizenship, people more involved in me and being more familiar with me, more energy, literate. Basically, what you and I are doing right now, Chris, right? Which
Right.
is sort
Right.
of like just being advocate and being familiar and participating in the public sphere about energy issues, right?
I think
But
what's kind of interesting though, as well as with the imperative of dealing with climate change, like that's kind of I think the sort of second part of the dual part of this drive towards energy democracy, it certainly flavors it massively, is that there's some of the responses are incredibly regressive and reinforce that energy poverty, and that would include things like subsidies to generally people who own property to put solar panels on their roof. Robert Bryce says he got 3 different subsidies to put that solar on his roof and receive the benefit of getting that knocked off your tax base. That kind of that's subsidized by the ratepayer in a regressive manner, as you mentioned. Or, in Ontario, there was, I think, a $5,000 rebate for buying an electric vehicle. And a lot of those were people buying, $50,000 to $100,000 Teslas. And I know that sort of stirred up a lot of anger, and I think that anger is justified. In California, there's the United Latinos Votes, who have put out statements against some of the, again, these are maybe less energy democracy and more sort of climate oriented policies, but ones that have been regressive and would punish poor people by, say, taxing you based upon how many miles you put on your car if you can't live downtown because you can't afford the housing. It's so there's lots of, it's ironic that a lot of the climate sided things in terms of this push end up being and contributing even more to the regressive nature of electricity use.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the is it unintended consequences of some of these policies, right? Because I mean, the other aspect of this is, so if you, and again, I've started delving into literature on what is energy democracy, because once it leaves sort of the activist narrative in the 2000s and enters sort of the academic narrative in the 2010s, and starts to kind of propagate out of the United States into Europe and into Canada, it means a lot of things for a lot of people. But I mean, fundamentally, it's two things. One is the idea of citizenship, of activism, where we're no longer just kind of passive stakeholders. We're interacting with the electricity system. But the other one is one of control, right? And this is where the money starts to matter, and it goes to the regressive nature, because ultimately, and we'll see this in the resolution by Representatives Bush and Bowman. Ultimately, there's this kind of idealization, this romantic ideal that comes out of this movement about kind of small, distributed, kind of citizen-driven way in which you control the energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereby you're in a reaction to what is a 80% private sector, large institutional structure in the United States, where most of your electricity comes from investor-owned utilities. In kind of response to that, there's this, well, look, we can do this ourselves through kind of local groups. There's this kind of assumption that lower level action is going to be fairer, is going to be kind of more just.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this move towards that, and then more importantly, there's a policy advocacy for either the state or policymakers or the actual institutions to be able to help finance this,
Yeah.
right? Because it's one thing for me to say, look, you know what, I'm going off grid and I'm going to set up my own co-op, and thank you very much, I'm done,
Yeah.
right? And then you
Yeah.
go off grid and you set up your own co-op, and it doesn't make any difference. But that's not the way it normally works, and we'll see
That's,
this.
to be clear, that's very much a luxury of high
Yeah,
income people.
yeah, agreed. But
Yeah.
that's not the way that we've described it. What it's saying is, I want to have my own solar panels.
Yeah.
I want to have control of my own energy, or I'm going to be a co-op.
You want to go from being Meredith Angwin called this a consumer to a prosumer.
Prosumer, that's right. But it's not like I'm going to grow tomatoes in my backyard. But what it's actually asking the state and ratepayers is, it's asking that I'm going to grow my own tomatoes in the backyard, and then I'm going to sell them back into the market at 3 or 4 or 10 times what I would otherwise cost in the market,
Right.
right? So in order to incent
And
this,
you have to buy them, right?
and you
Because it's
have to buy them.
electricity. You can't say, hey,
You
I don't
have
want
to
your
buy them.
tomatoes. I'm going to go buy cheap tomatoes. You got to
Right.
buy them.
That's right. That's exactly it. And
Yeah.
so the way it's done is that, whether it's a FIT or it's a what they call in California net energy metering, net
Right.
electricity metering, it's saying that, I'm not dropping out I'm using this system, and I'm requiring for you to subsidize, my view of how the electricity system will work, but I'm not independent of you. I'm asking you that you pay me 3, 5, or 10 times as much, to pump electricity back into the system through, through the panels or through the wind turbines. And
Right.
so that's where the inequity occurs, because what's happening is, and this is study after study, both in Germany, in the US, in Australia, in Canada, in California, in Illinois, in Florida. It's sort of like a general thing, is that the people who are actually buying the solar panels, or who are establishing the wind co-ops are generally high income people. They are being financed by the general rate base or by other ratepayers, and so you're seeing this inequity of a process that would otherwise be, going off grid, but which we can't stop people going off grid, but it's another thing where there's a policy decision to actually finance
Right.
those kinds of initiatives.
And I've come up with a few kind of spitballed terms for this, like the idea of like the electricity grid as a commons.
Hmm.
The as Robert Bryce says, the network that underlies all networks. It's an essential good, and I mean that's argued for in this HR resolution is the saying this is a human right. This is an essential good.
Right.
When it's the grid that we all invest into, we all care for, that's very different than this idea of kind of going off grid or sort of, a lot of these communities, again, they're high income communities. They're kind of fetishize these ultra efficient homes with a solar microgrid or something. I mean, that's kind of a defection from the commons. It's an electrically gated community. And then, the other thought I have is really around, this kind of Schumacher, small is beautiful thinking. I mean, it really betrays a bit of I think, a misunderstanding of economies of scale and efficiencies. The old response, I think, to dealing with energy poverty, like look at, say, post-war France, is a state owned and operated utility that sort of operates for the benefit of all. Like the state is no longer a sexy thing. It's we want to sort of fracture things up and have this kind of, maybe it's more of like a narco or anarchist perspective of like the only people that's trustworthy is kind of our own little micro community. But to reference something else, the kind of technological and engineering literacy that goes into that is reminiscent to me of the Great Leap Forward, where we were building little iron smelters in every backyard in China. And what I call the green leap forward, which is this idea of, every household's going to have a little mini wind turbine and a mini solar panel. And this is going to be great. It's going to help us, reach zero carbon. It's going to make us all better. And I mean, the language in this HR resolution is very much talking about, we're going to use solar and microgrids to respond, to be resilient in the face of extreme weather from climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. We're heading towards, with those policies, something, I mean, I don't know if we can say potentially as disastrous as the Great Leap Forward. I mean, there was massive famines that ensued, but when the grid goes down, people die, right? 200 people died in the Texas blackouts. And it could have been a lot worse. I mean, 5 minutes away from, what was that term again? You need a black start or whatever, right?
No,
it's
a complete shutdown. A complete shutdown. Yeah.
So, I mean, those are kind of a few reflections and ideas I've had over the years about this. But
yeah, no, I mean, look, agreed. And it's not, it's I wanted to, I mean, in preparation for this, I wanted to actually understand this, right? And that's sort of what I did. And so I sat down and read at least probably 10 articles to make sure that that my priors, as you'd say, my priors were in fact consistent. And like I said, I mean, there's a lot of great things about kind of like being energy citizens, but there comes a point in which, like the ownership, and whether or not you believe in public versus private ownership versus, versus, the idea that public ownership is almost as bad as private ownership, except when it is public ownership in terms of community at the community level, is something that obviously I understand. The evidence, we can have like a theoretical discussion, but the actual empirical evidence just doesn't support that. And that's fine because ultimately energy democracy is both a process. You and I are doing it right now, but it's also an aim,
Hmm.
right? And it's ultimately, a vision, right? And so if you move these visions towards it, but again, it's also very, and this is one of the interesting parts that you got at, it's also very technology specific,
Yeah.
right? So most people, um, when they write about energy democracy, are talking specifically, like in terms of
Yeah.
you got to think about what is the democratic aspect of this, right?
Mm.
In democratic aspect is you can have any kind of energy you want as long as it's 100% renewable.
And I mean that,
Right?
yeah, that speaks to a real delusion about the idea of the scale required for, again, what we were talking about, not just having everyone with a decent level of electricity consumption,
Right.
which supports those human development index goals, but also the need to electrify more and more elements of our economy to get to
That's right.
net zero. And so I think the reason it's 100% renewables, it fits into that ideological framework of, well, it seems to me to be easier to imagine, understand the processes,
Mhm.
understand a solar panel on my roof, than a nuclear plant, for instance,
Yeah,
right? That's
yeah,
something that doesn't fit within that ideology. But ultimately, I mean, the scale required for decarbonization, or for even meeting, our basic electricity needs that we have in,
right,
say, Europe,
right,
requires enormous
right,
installations, especially if they're to be economic, right? Where we need to just do, square kilometers of solar panels and,
right, right.
massive developments. It's not like we can have one little wind turbine in our little town and it's gonna.
Yeah, but you gotta, I mean, the other thing to do is that you cannot disassociate energy democracy with one of the main underlying themes of it, which is degrowth,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, so it's not as if, that critique that you're making, Chris, is for many amongst the energy democracy people would say, yeah, so what? We have to reduce our consumption, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we
Mm-hmm.
consume too much. And so you see that, for example, in the energy co-ops in Germany and in Denmark, where number one goal, reduce consumption, right?
And
And
and if it's
so
if it's with expensive electricity, like I've been on a lot of sort of, I mean, until they drove me off and until I decided it was a total waste of time, I've been on some sort of Green Party pages, and there was that sort of sentiment of, well, if it's expensive, we'll use less of it. I mean,
well, that's
even
exactly
even
it. Yeah.
Václav Smil kind of talks about that and advocates it, and obviously that's quite regressive. I mean, I have to say, like, I'm not an extremist on this. Like, I think there's room to decrease consumption. I mean, that's part of the kind of abolish the billionaires movement. And I think, you were saying that rich and poor people end up using the same amount of electricity. There's obviously extremes of that. And there's certain uses of energy, or, Václav Smil again laments the fact that internal combustion engines have gotten so much more efficient. We use the same amount of gas because we've decided we can't drive a 1-ton car. We need a 3-ton SUV.
That's right. That's
So,
right.
within the kind of eco-modernist sphere, there seems to be this idea of, like, hey, no limits, right?
Right,
Um,
right. No, no, no. Look, and we have to be fair about, the critiques of the worldview that you and I have many overlapping elements in versus the critiques that we're making right now of
right,
of the
right.
energy democracy movement. And yeah, obviously there has to be, there is a lot of wastage. But the what is difficult to square is the way in which in a democratic society we're going to make those decisions,
Mhm.
right? Like as in how much do we allocate, right? Or should
Yeah.
we even allocate, right? Like what are the mechanisms through the allocation? The other thing that I want to make a point of is that, and this is one Ontario thing specifically, is that because these energy democracy movements or ideals are kind of like vague, there's this aspirational thinking about the way in which it would work and whether or not it's transferable in time or in geography. Let me give you an
Right.
example. Um, Way before, people, American activists were talking about energy democracy, there was a long-standing cooperative movement in Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe, in Germany and Denmark, etc., that were doing a lot of things by themselves. And then eventually, many of them who were anti-nuclear kind of got tired of being anti-nuclear and started saying being pro pro energy, pro renewables, and so we now have maybe a thousand energy communities or co-ops in Germany, which is a lot, but still, I think makes up for, I don't know, certainly less than 1 or 2 or 3% of total electricity consumption. It's still popular, but in terms of actual total electricity used and consumed, it's still very modest. It's hard to get the numbers, but there's certainly one co-op per 100,000 people
Mhm.
or less in most of Germany. Um, but the idea of the small idealized community level co-op being sort of where we should aspire to captured the imagination of many people in Ontario, or
Mhm.
certainly many environmental groups in Ontario. And it was part of that process whereby they got behind the Green Energy Act of 2008. Um, and so it was with the idea that, we would have, as the old George Bush would say, 1,000 points of light where people would sprout out and we would have energy democracy. In the end, the latest analysis is that less than 3% of wind powered in Ontario is by co-ops.
Mhm.
90%, I think, is private enterprise, and about 7% are projects that are co-owned or co-sponsored by Indigenous groups.
Right.
So what you have is this idealization of a co-op that it's suddenly going to happen in North America, in Ontario, where you basically have a fundamentally different legacy and priors with a cooperative movement. The other critique of these kind of distributed ideals is that, and it's one of my main critiques of it, and I wrote about it in 2018, is that it opens the window for further neoliberal gains. What
Mhm.
you see that once you start to break up the grid, you allow capital to actually basically become welfare capital, right? And you see that most of the actual subsidies were not going to co-ops, they were not going even to high income people, they were going to corporations, mostly foreign corporations, right?
Mhm.
So the critique there is that the idea of green capitalism and green and energy democracy is very difficult to break up in practice from green capitalism.
Right.
And so you have this situation where not only are the high income people who are mostly taking advantage of these opportunities, but it's also corporations and a further privatization of the grid.
Of the grid. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that kind of fits into this, yeah, the green capitalism side of things. I mean, I think a lot of green parties are rejecting, I think some of them are very much born out of the left. That's that watermelon politics, analogy of a lot of sort of new left figures adopting that kind of green rubric. But I mean, there's a kind of common slogan amongst at least the Canadian Green Party, and I think others, not left, not right, but forward. And it's this, I mean, it's a rejection, I think, of kind of these old school progressive ideals, and I think we see that in the kind of policy that we're seeing. And I think the other thing that I really notice is that Albert Einstein famously said, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The response, say, of the Greens in Germany to the fact that their coal plants aren't getting phased out for, I think it's 2038, right? Another
Right.
17 years. We'll be done with
Yeah.
nuclear in another 2, I think. But
Yeah.
it's just like, well, we just have to throw more money at this. It's
Right.
not really a fundamental rethink or wait a minute, this isn't working. It's just, okay, well, society's not sacrificing enough to further subsidize this system, and whatever that might be, overbuild renewables 5, 6, 10 times, so that when your cap factors are 12 for solar,
Yeah, and you've got to think about that. I mean, you're getting at that right in terms of that. I've asked this question, and it's one of the reasons that I kind of got into this electricity sector, Chris, was that it's like don't don't environmentalists care right,
Right. Yeah.
about prices, and of course they do. I mean, if you were to ask an environmentalist, of course you do. But the kind of proof is in the pudding, right? Like the that that the idea of Armageddon, of climate crisis, is so important and so high priority, so order of magnitude more important than everything else, is that things like current income inequality are secondary and tertiary.
And then
And that's
I gotta say,
that,
what's primary is the anti-nuclearism. It seems overly simplistic, but honestly, with the actions of the NRDC trying to succeeding at shutting down
right.
Indian Point,
Yeah.
losing more clean energy than all the states, solar and wind. I mean, these are just, and in Ontario we have the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, strangely named, which has been fighting tooth and nail to shut down Pickering, and it directly results in climate harming increases in natural gas, right?
Yeah.
So it's
and so like, for example, right now, in California, they're discussing these net energy metering processes, sort of Mark III of the policy. And people who are talking about them as being inequitable, right? That's just, there are some people picking up on that, but there's a cost shift, right, from high income, like people who have solar panels, to those who do not, right? Again, it's only 10% of about $3 billion, right? And that is an incredible amount of money that is basically moving money from people who have solar to people who do not, and including mostly low-income people, right? So there's this incredible political shift, and the idea that this is inequitable is not even top of mind for most activists.
And is that dealt with within the HR resolution from
No,
Cori
no, it
Bush?
isn't.
So
No, it
that's not
isn't.
recognized or dealt with these
No, not
existing.
directly. Not
Yeah,
directly. I mean, there
because
will.
they talk a big game about environmental justice, about the issues of racialized, but also low wealth communities and how that
Right,
needs to be
right.
addressed.
Yeah,
But
and we'll talk. Yeah, and we should maybe discuss that. But I was just saying that, like, even now, the idea that there are, for future environmental gains and for the promotion of preferred technologies, that the end result is that we have to put up with more higher income inequality.
right,
To me, is one of those kind of like red lines that, for me, and like I wrote about in 2019, I will not cross that. There are better, more efficient ways to deal with that,
yeah.
and to downplay the importance of that, to me, in a highly unequal society like the United States is, to me, is just it's something that I will disagree with forever,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? But look, let's talk about this resolution. I mean, the
Sure. Yeah.
resolution came out. I'll just provide a quick summary. There's a lot of discussion on this on the internet, but basically, it's a resolution, so it's not law. It's kind of like the Green New
Green New
Deal
Deal.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
that AOC came out with. It's a resolution. This is put up by the members 5 and number 6 of the squad, right?
Right.
So if you have the squad that was elected in 2016, now you have Representative Cori Bush, I think from Missouri, and Jamaal Bowman from New York. So there's now 6 members of the squad. They're the 5th and 6th, and they put out a resolution June 2nd, which basically says, expressing that the United States must establish electricity as a basic human right and public good, and eradicate the reliance on monopolized, profit-driven utility corporations and providers, and the flawed regulatory regime that has failed to regulate these utilities in the public interest.
Great. Okay. Are we all on board with that?
Now, so ultimately, what is it? What's the proposal? Is that the federal government, so the big bad state, right,
Mm-hmm.
uses its money, right, to nationalize, to buy out, right, these investor-owned utilities that provide electricity, the Entergies of the world, the Con Eds of the world, the Pacific.
This is a capitalist renationalization. This is a buyout. It's not any kind of Castro-esque seizure of productive.
I don't know. They don't say it, but it talks about
I think they
purchasing,
do say
financing.
like
Yeah,
buying
yeah,
it.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
okay,
And then the idea being is that you have this, and then you buy it out, and then the federal government then gives it to appropriate levels, whether it's at the local level or at the county level or at the state level, but they
right,
don't get to. So the federal government doesn't do it anymore, right?
right.
So it's like it's not that they buy it and then they use it. It's they buy it and then transfer it to different levels of government.
And this is such a big issue, right? Because especially when we go back to this idea of community control. I mean, communities are so segregated in the States right now. I mean, in Canada as well, in my city in Toronto. I mean, the price of real estate in certain areas prices people completely out. And so the idea that you're going to achieve equity by fracturing up the grid and the electricity system and putting it in the hands of, they don't really define the size of these communities, but there's the real potential there for, again, electrically gated communities or just drastic differences in services, which are the farthest thing from progressive politics I can imagine.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, we know the history of the way in which things have worked and about the cross-fertilization from urban areas to rural areas. The idea of equalization across a federal country, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, but again, like there is that. So the idea being is that the federal government purchase it and
Yeah.
then they divvy it up and they give it to these municipalities, local levels, counties, whatever, and or they give that money to citizens groups that can then buy themselves out from whether it's a municipality or not,
Right.
right, in order to create these local citizen electricity generating entities.
I mean,
So that's
I personally have better things to do with my daily life than be a protagonist within this electricity commune, and put like it's just crazy. It's just crazy. And what strikes me is we've done, and I think you did on Emmett's show as well, this kind of history of how the electricity system developed, and it started off, I mean, with an entrepreneurial capitalist class that turned into kind of robber barons, but it started off with this fragmented, fractured grid, and then it was decided again that I think electricity is a public good and for the good of the country and to grow and et cetera, that we needed to take control at a state and federal level in the States and in these European countries to just fully kind of nationalize the sector. But now there's this kind of fragmentation back to the way it was, but with this maybe starry-eyed idea that it's all going to sort of fall democratically and equitably on these communities to run.
Right. And so that's sort of in terms of ownership, that's the way that it is foreseen. In the context of that, there are some provisions that deal with how even the cooperatives that exist now have been governed improperly, and how the Tennessee Valley Authority has also been um, not governed properly. And so there are provisions dealing with how existing structures. So basically, this resolution goes after the three main kind of like pillars of the way in which electricity is provided in the United States. It goes after the investor-owned utilities, the private utilities, by basically nationalizing them and then splitting them up into kind of like appropriate levels at the local. It critiques the federal institutions like the TVA about how they have not managed their electricity system well. It also critiques the co-ops, right, that exist and provide maybe 10 or 15% of electricity. So no one goes unscathed. And then, so that's the institutional aspect. There are a lot of missing things, like, for example, how it would be regulated, would it be self-regulated, et cetera. But then, so that's one aspect. And, there are things that I can support in that. There are things that I could not support on that. But then the other aspect is the prescriptiveness of the technology. So it's one thing to say, look, I'm going to take the big bad state that we don't trust anymore, but we're going to use the monetary power and financial power of the state to buy out these investor-owned utilities, and then I'm going to transition them down into kind of like a more devolved level. There's inconsistencies and contradictions in that very idea, because then ultimately what we would see is we would see a merger mania, right? Like we
Right.
saw in the 1920s that I discussed on the Exhaust podcast. You'd see a merger mania, right?
Right.
And then you'd have to have the state kind of regulating the idealized, romanticized size of what is the ultimately, you know,
Right.
these kind of communities of energy. There's that from an economics perspective. There's also the regulation perspective. How do we do the economic regulation? But also in terms of energy democracy, it's not up to these self-contained groups, whether at the state level, whether it's the Georgias of the world, the Minnesotas of the world, the Floridas of the world, or at a city level, to decide how they're going to actually generate their electricity. What the resolution says is it has to be 100% renewable,
Right.
right? So the idea of the contradiction in terms of it being energy, democracy, this is not very democratic when you're already prescribing the manner in which these supposedly independent and locally run institutions would ultimately provide the electricity. So again, it's 100% renewables. It doesn't answer any of the questions that I know you're going to raise about the idea that it's going to be 100% renewables.
Right.
And yeah, anyway, that's the kind of description of the resolution.
Again, I mean, what really kills me is this idea that it's, I mean, it's well intentioned, I think. I think, I mean, I have to hope that there's not any cynicism. I think the squad, are idealists that are very divorced from, what Emmett Penny and Meredith Engwin call kind of engineering discipline. But the idea that this is going to respond not just to deep decarbonization, which I have a lot of questions about. I don't believe that weather dependent tools can achieve small improvements in lowering carbon emissions, but I don't think they're capable because of the need to firm them with batteries, which add a certain amount of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Or what we've seen so far, gas. But there's a lot of language in the resolution, which is about how these distributed microgrids and storage and rooftop solar are going to give us climate resiliency. And in the setting of what we've just seen in Texas, there was a decision there made to spend about $60 billion, not on rooftop solar, but on large wind mega projects. With the understanding, the expectation that they would not be there at times of high demand, such as what happened in that winter storm. So that really baffles me, that sort of prescription that it has to be this technology, and that's, as you're saying, I think pretty fundamentally undemocratic. I could see a guidance on an aim towards zero carbon emissions, but again, this explicitly, AOC has said that the door has been left open to nuclear. I guess that's kind of as inviting as you can be if you exist within that politics and that's your constituency. But I mean, it's shut out of this agreement for sure. And certainly exist. There's actually a phrase in it lower down about sort of transitioning all the existing electricity infrastructure. Any new build has to be 100% renewable, but all existing energy infrastructure has to be converted to 100% renewable. So I guess that means we're going to shut down 100 gigawatts of nuclear, which is providing 20% of the U.S.'s electricity, and the majority of its ultra low carbon or zero emission electricity. We got to shut all that down.
That would be the
inference
implication.
from this, right?
No, I mean that would be the actual direct result if this were to become law, right?
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
I mean, there's obviously.
I mean, it's not going to happen, but I mean, it is a
no, but
policy
it's
proposal.
yeah, exactly. Because I mean, look, I mean, whether or not it's for me, I enjoyed reading it because after 2 weeks of pretty heavy duty Again, I'm not an expert on energy democracy, but looking at it, one of the things that everyone recognizes when you do the meta-analysis, et cetera, is that it's very amorphous, right? It's hard to kind of get your teeth around what exactly it means, because so much of it is aspirational into the future, right? And so it's hard to say that aspiration is wrong. What you can say is, look, on the ground, things like that have simply not worked, or they have worked, and so that's the evidence. But in a theoretical, you can't actually, when it's aspirational, you can't really argue with it. The beauty with the resolution, Chris, is that then this is like, it encapsulates in black and white what this would actually look like, right? And so I enjoyed reading it, because you're going to say, oh, okay, well, when we talk about energy democracy, how would one vision of that actually look like in the United States, in the context of us, like I said, 75% privately owned electricity sector. This resolution in Canada, the first part of which is being done, we already have 75% public.
Right.
Now, you'd have to have Hydro-Quebec be split up into, I don't know, smaller units, right? Because it's not appropriate at the provincial level. It would have to be smaller than that. I'm exaggerating and saying that tongue in cheek, but in Canada, we've already got this. In Iceland, we were just talking about Iceland. They already have this. It's all public power.
But it's not public, fractured up and controlled in these tiny community co-ops that have
well,
to
that's
run
exactly it. No, agreed. So because that goes.
Yeah, you're right. Like the first like that first couple sentences you read, I was nodding along. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It's
already
already
human right should be under public control. Bam.
Yeah. And so
everything after that is a disaster.
Well, and in the resolution, they talk about how again, they're not prescriptive beyond saying, look, it has to go at a sub-national level, that it's going to go at the state or municipality or as appropriate, and these kind of these smaller community level groups should be encouraged. So there's no prescriptiveness there, just to be fair. But the idea being is that the strong emphasis is on micro networks and smaller units that do not, and by design, do not take into account the huge, economies of scale, scope, and replication that are, the foundation of our current electricity grid. I mean,
and the foundation of a rapid build out, which again, we talked about, that was in the context of, rapid increases in demand, but we need this rapid build out if we're to A, decarbonize and replace all the existing fossil assets, but B, electrify everything, right?
Well, it's one of the reasons why, for example, right now, 20 years ago, wind turbines were, had a capacity, were like, 2 megawatt.
Yeah.
And now there are some that are as big as 4. Right.
5,
and and the same thing with with anything, with solar panels and more. There's economies there's economies in nuclear plants, there's economies in most things, and that's one of the reasons that we have relatively cheap and affordable power, electricity. And so the defragmentation and loss of those economies are actually going to drive the cost curves up.
Yeah.
Right. And it's going to make it more expensive.
I've been struggling to kind of describe this document, and I agree with you. It's kind of a fascinating, like, anthropological artifact of like the new left, right? And it's thoughts certainly about energy transition and decarbonization. And when I was trying to give a summary of it in the introduction, I couldn't find the words, but I just thought of it now. I think it's basically an advocacy for like an Occupy Wall Street grid. That's the politics is growing out of it. It's just I think we can have our critiques of Occupy Wall Street and this kind of leaderless, amorphous movement that ultimately, maybe you could say succeeded in giving a push to Bernie's 1% language and that kind of politics, but certainly not a way to run a vital commons that we all depend upon. Again, we depend upon it for our life. Like if you come into my hospital and you're sick and you want, you need a ventilator or anything like that, or dialysis, or even just basic simple things, it's really hard to operate in the dark.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah, no argument from me. No argument from me.
the Occupy Wall Street approach to the energy transition. Yeah.
There you go. Hashtag it.
Yeah. All right. I gotta let me jump on Twitter for a second. So I mean, I was just wanting to, I've got I took some notes here. And I think we already talked about the like Extinction Rebellion has talked about, getting to a zero emissions, not just grid, but whole energy system by like 2024 or something. This idea of unrealistic aspirations. And one thing that was really missing from this resolution, and the support of it is any trade union support, right? And that was brought up by folks like Fred Stafford, who are, I think, critical of the politics of the squad in that sense.
Yeah.
Why do you
look,
think, not maybe a leading question, but why do you think that is?
I don't know. Like, I mean, look, I mean, I can, I haven't followed the squad, and I don't know the politics of the DSA in the United States to be able to say whether labor was sought or it wasn't. But again, this is aspirational. One of the and I think it's useful. It's useful in terms of us being able to talk about it and us being able to kind of, say, yeah, this sounds pretty good. This is interesting, and this thing we can't agree on, or one way or another. I think I see it as a cultural aspirational argument, like signaling the kinds of the kinds of issues that are of interest, to that wing of the Democratic Party.
I mean, it's aspirational, but it's so highly ideologic, right? I mean, one of the statements here is, one of the inferences or things they claimed. It's not an exact quote, but basically the Texas and California blackouts are blamed exclusively on this, investor-owned marketized system. And I think there's lots of reasons, and we've talked about critiques of deregulation, et cetera. But I mean, if that's the only lesson you've drawn away from those blackout events, we got a real problem here.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, and I've been on your show twice before, and I've talked about regulation, and I've talked about transitions, and I've talked about the political economy and of nationalization. So look, I mean, I could, one could write a whole essay on this, and it's still maybe at the back of my mind something to do.
Right.
But in terms of what we can talk about it during the show, it is a purely aspirational document. But I mean, I think ultimately, one of the things that my takeaway, Chris, is that we do have to do more in terms of things like energy poverty, more than we've done already, right? Like, for those of who are involved, in the sector, there's obviously a need to pony up, and for people like we're in Ontario, to improve the generosity and the eligibility for programs that are specifically designed to to reduce energy poverty. Those things were instituted, and one of the things it's incumbent to do, and I've been supported and I've talked about it, is to actually even push harder, because we've got to recognize that regardless of the technical understanding of the system, there is sufficient unease about the idea that is unjust, that is undemocratic, that we have to be responsive in a way that tries to address some of those issues, and it's hard not to be, in a non-paternalistic way, so that those issues are just reduced and mitigated in order to be responsive to the very legitimate concerns about about energy poverty and about the relative closeness of the system.
And it's interesting though that that response to that angst about this kind of energy inequity, in Ontario, it led to the fall. I mean, there's maybe other factors, but it led to the fall of a longstanding Liberal government and a Conservative government that was elected largely on a platform of abolishing or breaking up these lucrative renewable energy contracts.
That's exactly
and reversing the GEA, right? So
it's one of those funny things, right? Is that there was this unintended kickback, or this unintended result, as you say, is that that the effect of the renewables was to increase prices, and then the political reaction boomerang to that was to actually eliminate in Ontario the potential for renewables to grow for at least a generation, right? Like, I mean, I don't think, whether it's another wind turbine or more solar farms, that's dead in the water politically, because of this very bitter taste in the mouth that whole process led to. So what politician is going to ever be advocate of that, right? So that's something that's kind of like boomeranged and kicked you in the butt.
So, I mean, we've done a lot of critique here. We've been going for about an hour. I hate to put guests on the spot like this, but what are, if you ruled the world, if you ruled the grid,
oh my God,
if you could design policy, like just in broad strokes, what would that look like for you?
Oof. Jesus, can we do that in another episode? You want like a tweet, 140,
40, maybe a thread.
Yeah. No.
We'll plant the seed now.
Let's do that. Let's do that for future. Like, I mean, there's just so many other issues, but yeah. No, I mean, look, obviously, as you could tell from my prior experiences, governance is fundamental, and strong institutions are also very important. The nature of whether it's public or private, the nature of whether it's small or large, are purely what I consider technocratic issues that ultimately have to have some kind of trade-off between, the efficiency and the prices that come out of that, the environmental impact, and also equity concerns. So, I mean, that's one tweet.
Sure.
We'll get to it for the longer thread, perhaps in another show, Chris.
So, Edgardo, is there anything else that you wanted to close with, or any other topics you felt like we neglected? Again, maybe in tweet lengths here, but because we're
no, this is fine. I mean, you've been very generous with your time. I'm very happy to be here on a third episode with you, Chris.
Yeah.
We have good discussions, and maybe looking forward to the next time that we get a chance to chat.
Excellent. Okay. And I will look forward to hearing you, I think, on some other podcasts soon. Okay, Edgardo, a pleasure. Thank you for making the time. I know you put a lot of work into prepping for these, and seems to be a real passion for you. So thank you. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.